What if the oldest story humanity ever wrote down is not about gods, not about creation, not about war, but about a man who refused to die? 4,000 years ago, a king stood at the walls of his city and refused to accept death. His city was called Uruk. It stood in what is now southern Iraq, in a region the ancient world called Mesopotamia, a Greek word meaning land between the rivers, the flat, sun-scorched plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. By the standards of its time, around 2700 BCE, it was not a city, it was a world. Perhaps 50,000 people lived within its walls. The surrounding lands were villages. Uruk was the future.
Who was this king, and how did his story vanish for 20 centuries? The king's name was Gilgamesh, a Sumerian king of the early dynastic period. He was, the stories say, 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, strong enough to be extraordinary, human enough to suffer. And he knew something that has never stopped being true, that he was going to die. His name was forgotten for 2,000 years. The city of Uruk crumbled into the desert, buried beneath centuries of sand and silence, after the civilizations that remembered him were conquered and erased.
The tablets on which his story was written, copies made by Assyrian scribes some 2,000 years after Gilgamesh himself had lived, were buried under the ruins of Nineveh when that city fell in 612 BCE and lay there in the dark for nearly 25 centuries. And then, in 1872, someone dug them up. And you discover that the oldest story humanity ever wrote down is a story about a man who refused to accept that he would die. That man is you.
Who was the unlikely person who rediscovered that story? And what exactly did he find inside a fragment of ancient clay? The year is 1872, London. The British Museum. A man named George Smith is bent over a clay tablet. He is not a professor. He has no university degree. He is a banknote engraver, the kind of craftsman who cuts the fine, precise lines into metal plates that become printed currency. But for years, on his lunch breaks and after work, he has been teaching himself to read Cuneiform, the ancient Mesopotamian script that ancient Mesopotamian scribes pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, then left to dry in the sun or hardened in a fire. The tablets he is reading had arrived at the British Museum 20 years earlier, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh by the British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard, a diplomat turned explorer who spent years digging through the ruins of the ancient Assyrian capital and sent back to London tens of thousands of clay fragments. Most had not yet been read by any modern human eye.
What gift did George Smith possess that allowed him to see what no one else had seen in those tablets? Think of it like a musician who can hear a complete melody even when most of the notes are missing, because the pattern tells the brain what should be there. That is exactly what Smith's engraver's eye did with the marks on ancient clay. The same pattern recognition that made him a skilled craftsman allowed him to see structure where trained academics saw chaos. He had already made significant contributions to the decipherment of Assyrian texts when, that autumn, he picked up a fragment, tablet number 11 of what would later be called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and began to read.
What was written on that tablet that made George Smith stop cold? And why did it send a shockwave through the entire 19th century world? And he read about a flood, a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A man warned in advance by a sympathetic deity, an ark built to survive the rising waters, birds sent out to find land, a sacrifice offered when the waters recede. George Smith put down the tablet, stood up, and, by some accounts, began to remove his clothes in the excitement of the moment. Whether that particular detail is accurate or not, what is certain is this. On the 3rd of December, 1872, he stood before the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London and announced that he had found a flood story older than the book of Genesis. Prime Minister William Gladstone was in the audience. The Times of London ran the story. The theological world went into a quiet panic. Why did a flood story pressed into Babylonian clay shake the foundations of Western religious belief? For centuries, the biblical narrative had been understood as unique, the divinely revealed account of God's dealings with humanity. And here, pressed into ancient Babylonian clay, was essentially the same story, told by a civilization that predated the Bible by more than 1,000 years. The questions that followed were uncomfortable, and they are not entirely resolved today. But the most important question is not where the Bible got this story.
The most important question is, what story does this flood narrative belong to? What is the text it comes from? The answer is, it comes from an epic, a 12-tablet poem about a king named Gilgamesh. And what that epic says at its core is that a man confronted his own mortality and went to the ends of the earth to try to defeat it, and failed, and found in that failure something unexpected.
But before you can understand what Gilgamesh found in his failure, who was this king? Was he real? Gilgamesh was almost certainly a real person. The Sumerian king list, a clay tablet that records the ruling dynasties of the ancient Mesopotamian city-states of what is now Iraq, includes Gilgamesh as the 5th king of the first dynasty of Uruk, with a reign assigned the legendary length of 126 years. Modern scholars, including the Assyriologist Andrew George of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, whose 2003 critical edition of the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic remains the standard scholarly text, place a historical Gilgamesh somewhere around 2700 to 2500 BCE. He was, in all probability, a powerful ruler of early Uruk, a military leader and builder, whose deeds were extraordinary enough that stories began to circulate about him within a century of his death. Those stories grew. Over the following 500 years, they became something far larger than historical memory. They became myth. By the time the Sumerian poets, working during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, a great political and cultural renaissance in ancient Mesopotamia, centered in the city of Ur in southern Iraq, roughly between 2112 and 2004 BCE, were writing down the first Gilgamesh poems, the historical king had become a figure of cosmic proportions, a being 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, of superhuman strength and beauty, lord of a city that itself was a wonder of the ancient world. What was Uruk, and why does it matter that the oldest epic in history begins and ends not with a god, but with a city's walls? Uruk, at its peak, was extraordinary.
Estimates of its population at around 2700 BCE range from 40,000 to 80,000 people. Figures supported by the archaeological surveys of Robert Adams of the University of Chicago, who spent decades mapping ancient settlement patterns across the Mesopotamian plain. In a world where most human settlements were villages of a few hundred, Uruk was staggering. It had monumental temples, the White Temple, raised on a great mud brick platform dedicated to Anu, the ancient Mesopotamian sky god, visible for miles across the flat plain. It had a complex economy, specialized labor, long-distance trade networks. It had writing. Think of writing as beginning the way a spreadsheet does, not to tell a story, but to track numbers, grain in, livestock out. The story came later. Uruk is the place where writing was invented around 3200 BCE, not as literature, but as accounting. What Uruk was, in other words, was the first city in the way you now understand cities: dense, complex, stratified, impersonal in the way that large human concentrations always become. A place where you could be anonymous, where the old bonds of tribe and kinship were replaced by the bonds of institution and trade. A place that looks entirely recognizable to anyone living in a modern metropolis today. Why does the oldest literary epic in human history open not with a battle or a divine vision, but with a command to look at the walls? The Epic of Gilgamesh opens with a command, not a narrative, not an introduction, a command to the reader. Look at the walls. See its walls which gleam like copper. Look at the inner wall which has no equal. Touch the threshold stones, they are from ancient times. Climb the walls of Uruk and walk around. Examine the foundations, inspect the brickwork. Is it not made of fired brick? Did not the 7 sages lay its foundations? The oldest literary epic in human history opens not with a battle, not with a love story, not with a supernatural vision, but with architecture, with the invitation to look at what a man built. Because the walls are Gilgamesh's answer to the question the entire epic asks. You will come back to this. What does it mean to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal? And why is that formula more relevant to you today than it might seem? The formula that defines Gilgamesh is more precise than it first appears. He is not a god. He cannot have the one thing gods have by definition: immortality. He is too divine to accept the ordinary consolations that allow ordinary men to make peace with their deaths, the comfort of children, of community, of simple pleasures. He sees too far, desires too much, suffers too acutely. But he is too human to escape the biological fact that he will die. Think of it like being given a telescope powerful enough to see the entire universe, but having eyes that can only focus for a few decades before they go dark. That is the Gilgamesh condition, the capacity to perceive infinity locked inside a finite body. He is the figure of modernity before modernity had a name, the person who knows too much to be at peace and not enough to transcend the condition he finds himself in. He is, in the deepest sense, extremely American, not in a trivial sense, in the deepest sense. A culture that believes it can do anything, build anything, solve anything, and that still cannot look death in the eye without flinching. A culture of extraordinary walls, extraordinary cities, extraordinary achievements, and a profound, structuring terror of the one thing that cannot be engineered away. Why does the Epic of Gilgamesh exist in multiple versions spanning over 1,000 years,
And what does that evolution reveal about the one question that kept becoming more urgent with every generation that touched the text? One of the things that makes the Epic of Gilgamesh so unusual is that you can watch it being written. Unlike the Iliad or the Odyssey, the ancient Greek epics traditionally attributed to the poet Homer, whose origins are lost in an oral tradition that can only be partially reconstructed, the Gilgamesh epic survives in multiple versions spanning more than 1,000 years of composition. And when you lay those versions side by side, you see something remarkable. The theme of the pursuit of immortality becomes more central, more urgent, more fully developed with every generation that touches the text.
What is the oldest layer of the Gilgamesh story, and how does it differ from everything that came after? The oldest layer is the Sumerian poems, 5 separate narrative poems written in Sumerian, the language of the ancient civilization that invented writing, composed during the 3rd dynasty of Ur around 2100 BCE. These poems are not yet a unified epic. They are separate episodes, a political confrontation, an expedition to a cedar forest, a battle with a divine bull, a descent to the underworld. Gilgamesh is already concerned with death, already driven by the desire to make his name last, but the theme is an element among several. Then, because the political and emotional landscape of ancient Mesopotamia had shifted, what emerges around 1700 BCE is the Old Babylonian version, written in Akkadian, the Semitic language of ancient Babylon, which served as the dominant literary and diplomatic language of the ancient Near East for over 1,000 years. Here, something fundamental changes. For the first time, the emotional engine of the story becomes the death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh's companion, his closest friend, in many ways his other self. Because it is specifically Enkidu's death that triggers the pursuit of immortality, grief, not abstract ambition, becomes the motor. The text grows more intimate, more psychologically precise.
Who shaped all of this material into the unified work you can read today? And what makes that person historically unique? Around 1200 BCE, a Babylonian exorcist priest named Sin-leqi-unninni, whose name means roughly, "O moon, accept my prayer," does something that had never quite been done before. He takes this accumulation of material, Sumerian, Akkadian, oral, written, court tradition, temple tradition, and shapes it into a unified, architecturally coherent literary work. 12 tablets, a prologue that tells you, before the story even begins, what the story means, an ending that returns deliberately to where it started. Sin-leqi-unninni is documented in the Babylonian literary catalogues as the author of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He is the first named author in world literary history whose name is connected to a specific work. Homer is a tradition, a name given to a long oral process. Shakespeare drew on earlier sources. But Sin-leqi-unninni is a documented individual who looked at 4 centuries of accumulated stories and understood how to make them mean something. What he added, above everything else, was the prologue, those opening lines about the walls of Uruk. Because the prologue tells you how to read the ending. The walls are there at the beginning and at the end. Whatever Gilgamesh gains and loses and searches for over the course of 12 tablets, the walls are what remains. The work is what remains. The text itself, the very epic you are reading, is what remains.
What did the leading scholarly study of the Gilgamesh epic's evolution conclude, and why does that conclusion matter for you? Jeffrey Tigay of the University of Pennsylvania,
whose 1982 study, The Evolution of the Gilgamesh Epic, remains the definitive account of how the text changed across 12 centuries, concluded something worth stating plainly. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not a static religious text. It is a living organism. It was revised, expanded, deepened by each generation that inherited it, because each generation found in it a pressing question about their own lives. And the question that became increasingly pressing as Mesopotamian civilization grew more complex was not how to please the gods, or how to win in battle, or how to govern a city. It was, what do we do about the fact that we die? What does it mean for you, right now, today, that the oldest story humanity ever wrote down is a story about a man who refused to die? Think about that for a moment. Not a story about the creation of the world, not a story about the will of the gods, not a story about the founding of a city or the victory in a war. The oldest story, the one that a civilization thought important enough to copy and recopy for over 1,000 years, to translate into other languages, to carry across the ancient Near East, from Iraq to Israel to Turkey to Syria, is a story about a man who looked at his own death and said no. You live in a culture, right now, today, that is spending billions of dollars on exactly the same refusal. A culture that has sent men to the moon and is planning to send them to Mars, that has mapped the human genome, that is engineering artificial intelligence systems of inhuman capability, and that still, at its deepest level, cannot look death in the eye without flinching. That culture is not new. It is 4,000 years old. And its name, the first time around, was Gilgamesh. In the next video, you go back to the beginning, to the oldest Sumerian poems, to the first layer of the story, to a king who understood, in words that were being written down while the Egyptian pyramids were still under construction, that fame is the only immortality available to mortals, and that this might not be enough. The man existed. The city existed, the tablets existed. And in the next video, you go back even further to the oldest layer of the tradition, the 5 Sumerian poems that preceded the unified epic by centuries, and in which the question of death is already being asked with a clarity that has never been surpassed. If what you heard in this video surprised you, leave a comment below with the one fact that changed how you see the ancient world. Read what others are writing. You will find that the surprise is shared. If you want to follow this series to its conclusion, where that question travels from ancient Mesopotamia all the way to Silicon Valley, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every video in this series builds on the last. Missing one means missing part of the argument. And if this series is worth your time, it is worth sharing with one person who has never heard the name Gilgamesh. That is how a 4,000-year-old story keeps traveling.